You're very kind. No, first of all, can everybody hear me? Yes. All right, if you can't hear me, just speak up, because I don't like going to places where I can't hear when the person speaking is mumbling. Anyway, actually 30 years, it's actually now closing in on 45. But no, there's no need to do that. No, wouldn't be prudent. Anyway, let's start this. Now, who is this pictured here? Who can tell me? Raise your hand if you think it's Seward. Okay, I thought it was Seward until my brother informed me, no, that's not Seward, that's Baranoff. So who better to have on a book about Seward than not Seward? And Terrence reminds me, it's sort of like the cover to Vic Fisher's great book about the Alaska Constitutional Convention. If you've ever looked at it, it shows a beautiful drawing of Denali as seen through the windows of Constitution Hall. Now, and that's the caption in the book. It says, as seen through. Not quite. I guess that's license. Anyway, this is Seward. This is the new statue in Juneau, which was commissioned for part of this year's activities, which just went up across the street from the Capitol. And the legislators will be able to take a look at this tomorrow when they're back down there. Because they've had a lot of work to do this year, apparently. At least it's taken a lot of time. I'm going to sort of spin through a few things here. This is the check with which Alaska was purchased. Everybody knows, that happened in 1867, $7.2 million. It was either a tremendous bargain or it wasn't. Generally, Western newspapers thought it was a great idea. Many in the East, the effete East perhaps, thought it was not a very good idea. And so the mythology that it was widely ridiculed developed out of the notion that key Eastern newspapers opposed it, including those in New York, and several in New York. So you can see how that might influence the way historians recorded it. The 150th year, it's kind of interesting to look at how Russians look at this and how we look at this. Now, this is from March, and it was I'm sure you all can read this, but I can't. And this is a story about the Prime Minister of Crimea saying, if Russia was in possession of Alaska today, the geopolitical situation in the world would have been different. Yes, that's probably easy enough to say. This Russian military magazine, The Alaska We've Lost, that's the headline on this. This was, by the way, part 2. You can probably figure out part 2 there. But this is, and there's some other views as to how, we might view Alaska and who, what people think. Now, oh, okay. All right. So anyway, okay. So Putin does not want Alaska apparently. Okay, and but this is a good question. What do you think Obama will do when Putin sees Alaska? Well, that's a good question today. What do you think, Obama will do when Putin sees Alaska today? Okay. Well, now this is not an official, this is sort of a response to the president. But, he has got lots of good things to say. Well, you probably can't read it because this is screwed up a little bit. This was today, actually. Senator Melissa Murkowski of the great state of Alaska really let the Republican Party and our country down yesterday. Too bad. I mean, he could have added sad or something. But, he has a clear vision of things. And, we have to look around and see where we are today. Now, this, of course, is the time that our former governor made it onto the cover of the New Yorker. And as you can see, this is in essence the Tina Fey version of things that, you cannot see Alaska from my house, and she didn't say that. She didn't. She said truthfully, you can see parts of Russia from Alaska. But let's just sort of back up a bit here. Now, after the purchase, the federal role in Alaska was pretty limited, and Congress was really slow to act. And the Organic Act took place about 15 years after the purchase, and that just called for a governor. There was no real local government in Alaska until the Territorial Government was created in 1912. Now, this is by Judge James Wickersham, who was sort of a key fellow not only in the founding of Fairbanks and the University of Alaska and the creation of the Alaska Railroad, but also in the promotion of territorial status, and he was the first real advocate for Alaska statehood. And this was his bill, his first, the bill promoting statehood in 1916. It did not really go anywhere, and the statehood movement, that would have been a pretty grave mistake to make Alaska a state at that time. So it developed over the next, 35, 40 years or so, and World War II was a big turning point. But I can see I have my stuff a little bit out of order here, which is keep it par for the course. I like this book, titled Our New Alaska, or The Seward Purchase Vindicated, by Charles Halleck. It's from the 1880s. I'm not sure I can't read that, but anyway. But here's why I like it. This line: Alaska has been egregiously misconceived, maligned, and misrepresented. The very encomiums which enraptured tourists have bestowed upon her alpine, well, this guy's hard to swallow. The very encomiums which enraptured tourists have bestowed upon her alpine scenery have served to discourage settlement or adventure. Men forgetting what the forbidding Alps do not constitute the whole of Switzerland. Anyway. The notion that I gather from that is this sense that Alaska is mistreated and misunderstood by the federal government. And I think there's really a lot of good evidence from early on that notion was promoted, and it has some justification. I think it's overplayed to a degree, but it does have some justification. And much of what this author was saying remained, in currency here with this book by Commonwealth North about 30 years ago, which now this slide is pretty bad, but this is the Anchorage Bonfire on the night that the Senate approved statehood in 1958. And you'll never see a fire exactly like that color, but this was a Jack Coghill effort and some others. And, the theory was that promises made under the Statehood Act were not being fulfilled. And that still is a part of our politics today, a big part. And there's room to argue about that. I don't think it's all I think you can see areas where it's true and areas where it's not true. That's how I would look at it. But in terms of federal involvement here, this is the one big start after territorial government was created, the building of the Alaska Railroad. That was particularly crucial for Fairbanks. It's a good case to be made, I think, that Fairbanks would not have continued as a town had it not been for the building of the Alaska Railroad, which was the first really major federal public works construction project here. And it was delayed. It took a lot longer than expected. It was under both Wilson and Taft, and and then Harding. This was Harding's final act upon the scene, was the driving of the Golden Spike near Nenana. And that creation of the railroad really helped ensure a fuel supply for Fairbanks for coal instead of wood, because wood was pretty bad to have the whole community relying on wood when there was no alternatives. But the building of the railroad allowed large-scale dredging to become a factor, and that really kept the economy going here until World War II. So I think the railroad is a key example of, I'm not sure if it was federal largesse. It certainly wasn't justified on economic grounds at the moment when it was done, but it was about a vision of the future, that there would be industrial and economic development in the years following the construction of the railroad. Secondarily, and maybe not secondarily, actually probably more than anything else, federal spending has taken a we have not been able to survive without it. This is World War II. It was when the military first became a big item here, really right before the war, which is why the original facilities on Fort Wainwright are of such high quality. Hangar number 1 and the utilidor system that was built to supply hangar number 1 and other facilities there, which is still in pretty good shape. You can tell that was done when this country was not under wartime pressure, and everything that followed at Ladfield, now Fort Wainwright, there were a lot of Quonset huts that were not of the same quality of construction as the original investment there. But military spending, and that military role in Alaska is essential. It's about 1/5 of the Fairbanks population, and it still, we don't know where this is going exactly, right? Now, this was the New York Post headline, which I used in a column last week about, this is not as good as headless body and topless bar, but this is or Ford the City dropped dead, but this is, this is close. And then we have public works projects such as this one, which has saved Fairbanks' bacon many times, and this is the Chena Lakes Flood Control Project, $250 million or more actually by now, and Fairbanks would have flooded many times over in the last, since the project went into operation about almost 40 years ago, 35, 40 years ago. This federal investment has really helped. Now, on the other hand, you have this continuing notion that began early on of the federal government being far away and unresponsive to Alaskans' needs. And that existed during territorial times, and it exists today. It's an element in that certain people like to bring up over and over again. It stems largely from our situation of the federal government owning 60% of the land in the state. But going back, Greening and others hammered home on this point, people of both parties really, in the drive to create this state of Alaska. And I'm glad to see John Coghill here. His dad was a key player at this event at the creation of the Constitution here. So in light of, by the way, the picture of Denali, it's also interesting that when the News Monitor ran a picture of that building, they painted Constitution Hall on the picture, even though the name was not on the building yet. So anyway, we can be, the American flag might have looked like many different things. We never know what it might have looked like with the 49 star. So here is Fred Seaton and Mike Stepovich. These are submissions in the flag contest when Alaska entered the Union in 1959. Now, on the day that Alaska entered the Union, this little story appeared in the Juneau Empire, which is kind of amazing, actually, when you think about it. It's kind of, I thought, in that Senator Stevens was working then for the Interior Department, and he, his continual involvement with Alaska first in the territorial, first in the state legislature, and then later in the U.S. Senate, was sort of a key to shaping the state that we have today. There has been no real accounting, and when Senator Stevens was alive, he didn't want any accounting of how much federal money he had directed this way, because it probably would not have been a good idea to do that. But it's worth an examination, and it's unfortunate, I think, that the Ted Stevens papers are still not available to researchers, because if somebody is to ever write a good book about Ted Stevens, you'll need access to those documents. Quite a bit of government money has gone into them. The Alaska legislature appropriated money to help process them when they were on the Fairbanks campus, but there was a little disagreement, and they've now gone back to Anchorage. Papers are in Anchorage under private control. That's a sort of a wealth that archived there. I don't want to get, that's a tangent that I'm just sort of interested in that myself. But I just do think there should be, for researching Alaska history, those documents are essential. And I'm afraid that maybe the reason for not having them open might have something to do with, let's call them editing. Editing, let's say that. I don't know. That bothers me, though. Those papers should be open, just as the Greening and the Bartlett papers are here at the University of Alaska, and every other member of Congress. Actually, the Frank Murkowski papers are here, but I don't think those are open either. But that's well. Again, excuse me for my tangents, but that's the way my brain works, or doesn't work. This is the structure of the territorial government, right? We got it? Clear. And anyway, just so you don't have to read any of this, you just have to know that it had all these different commissions, and it was just all over the place, all of which were designed apparently, allegedly, to limit the power of the executive. So you make the governor as weak as possible by assigning little this and that, museums to one group, and you assign roads to somebody else, and you just divide it all up, and it's an ineffective way of doing a business. When the state started, now it's a good deal more complicated than this today, but this was the idea was we're going to have a simple structure, the governor at the top, which is sort of what we have. We have very strong executive under the state constitution. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to, flow smoothly. In fact, things never ever flow smoothly. It's just that's the way things are. I wanted to show you this. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anyway, so this is now. Anyway, but here I want to get to this is a key question here. All right, so I'm glad this economist wrote this paper in 2009. Was the Alaska Purchase a good deal? Now, Mr. Barker went into great detail on this, and he said, who can get, do you think he thought it was a good deal? Who says yes? No, it was not a good deal. He was, yeah, well, I just think this was his conclusion, okay? Since the purchase appears to have been a poor financial bargain for the citizens of the United States at the time, non-economic considerations must have played an important role in the purchase. Okay. Lies, damn lies and statistics, that's what you have here with this guy as far as I'm concerned. Now, there's two people that, after this paper appeared, my brother Terrence wrote, and actually he said, which I thought was actually a very good point, and I'm going to steal it from him. He said, he answered the question this way. What struck me at the time was how peculiar it was of him to ask the question. No state is really a good deal in the sense that he indicates, but neither was the Erie Canal, the interstate highway system, the Jersey Turnpike, or the Brooklyn Bridge. I just wonder what road anywhere in America has ever paid for itself and its upkeep, ever made a profit. Actually, probably some of the turnpike, well, I don't know about that. If it was not still federal money. Maybe the Erie Canal. Yeah,
well, not by this guy's statistics.
Yeah, well, okay. So I asked another expert, my son Connor, who's an economist, and my question was, well, do you think this guy is joking? That was my question. He says, yeah, I think he's being serious. It's a decent argument in some ways, but as far as I understand, he doesn't really count the value of natural resources so much as the government's tax revenue from managing and taxing those resources. There's a long answer here. But so basically, his argument boils down to the claim that the federal government doesn't make money off Alaska, which of course it doesn't and probably never will. Now, which I think somebody, I hope that wasn't my phone, okay. I think in Alaska, his argument is too convoluted for me to bother going into detail in this, just to say that he thought instead of paying $7.2 million, the United States should have got it. Russia should have paid the United States a small amount. That's his argument. You know, so anyway, but you can prove anything with statistics. Okay, so who owns Alaska? Again, if we talk about friction between the federal government and the state government, and the course of the last 150 years, this land control is a real dominant issue, and it remains so today. So, and this is from 2000. It hasn't changed much since then, although the pace of federal land transfers to the state has accelerated. At statehood, the state of Alaska was able to select 105 million acres of land total. It's a good thing that statehood was delayed until 1959 in that regard, because the earlier proposals had all been, most of them had been for a smaller land grant. And we can thank W.C. Fish Arnold, who was the main lobbyist for the canned salmon industry, and others, who opposed statehood routinely, and President Eisenhower, who was not in favor of Alaska statehood, and others, for delaying this. The Democrats had wanted statehood for Alaska for a long time, and many people in Alaska wanted it as well. But had statehood been approved under the earlier plans in the earlier 50s, the land grant would have been much smaller. Some might say that the land grant should have been larger. Well, it's 105 million acres. It's the size of the state of California. The state has an immense amount of land, and it's not just mountaintops and, you know, swamps. In fact, when the state went about to select its land, it tried to avoid doing that. One of the real legitimate beefs that the state has with the federal government over the years has been the slow pace of the land transfer. It was supposed to have taken 25 years. It's still not done. And it's not done for several reasons. The biggest one being the series of roadblocks that appeared in the 1960s. Had statehood been delayed, the land grant might have been, who knows what the land grant might have been. By the 1960s, when native land claims started to be recognized as a real issue, that was the really first big roadblock in the state land selections, because how can the state be selecting all this land when we haven't resolved the native land claims that were unresolved since 1867? So when the United States purchased Alaska, it put off this question, and it put it off in every major piece of legislation that followed, in the Organic Act, in the act that created the territory, and in the Statehood Act. It only came to a head because of the land freeze in the 1960s, and then the pressure to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and the oil companies became big advocates for settling Alaska Native land claims, which assistance has really helped. And the Nixon administration proved a big ally to Alaska Natives and a big ally to the oil companies in sort of pushing getting the pieces in line to try to get the pipeline built. But we still have this fight over land and land access. The portion of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act included language saying that, you know, some land also has to be set aside for parks. It was more complicated than that, but in essence, that's what led to the big D2 lands fight, D2 referring to a section of the legislation. And so between most of the 1970s, up until the election of President Reagan, this Alaska lands battle was sort of the key fight in Alaska and in DC. And if I remember quite well, talking to Ted Stevens at that time, who he detested Mike Gravel. They did not get along, and I just remember the day he said, yes, from now on, it's Gravel, lowercase g, it's gravel. So he said, I'm not going to say his name. So, and a lot of people say this, but he says, you know, he's the show horse and I'm the workhorse. So, well, Gravel's idea was to try to stop a lands bill. Stevens maybe sort of wanted to accommodate it. In the aftermath, you know, people might have said, well, Gravel maybe Gravel was right, and maybe had it been delayed, you know, we might have got a better deal. Of course, it depends upon what you interpret as a better deal. Jimmy Carter considered the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act as the highlight of his career and probably the most important environmental legislation of the 20th century. And you know, opinions on that were split in Alaska. They probably are split today as well. I'm sure they are. It's just that the passions about that have died down a good deal. But that remains an issue, right? What rights do we have as Alaskans over federal land that is presumably owned by everybody in the United States? And it's unsettled, and it continues to be argued with each administration reinventing the wheel, which is sort of happening now with the Interior Department, and it happened under the Obama administration with the Interior Department, and it happened under the Bush administration with I mean, since the Clinton administration, we've had, you know, well, let's go back farther than that. Since James Watt, we've had, in Reagan's first term, we've had, you know, different directions that were advocated. Oh, this is my slide about his economy. Never mind. Well, just forget that. Pay no attention to that. Okay. All right. Now, okay. This is the town that can't wait for tomorrow. This is from the Saturday Evening Post right before statehood. And I'd just like to show this picture because of the caption, which is 4th Avenue, the main drag of the largest city in Alaska, where an ordinary hamburger costs, I think it's some 85 cents, 25, it costs some cents. But this is my favorite line. The gentleman with the beard is a sourdough, not a beatnik. So, anyway, so I like that. So that's the Saturday Evening Post. Here's 3 years later from the Saturday Evening Post. Well, we're not asking that question today, which is good. We're not asking that question today. But it was a serious question.
What's the date?
This is from '63. This is, well, with statehood, the state was given a big pot of transition money, and it was running out as this occurred. And things were not going as well, you know, as with everything else. The speed with which development was occurring was not happening. Well, this is backing up. This is the Wall Street Journal 1 year after statehood. Now, this is a headline, and I got a couple other here, that you could show lots of times. So this could be problems pile up fast for 49 states. It finishes, what year is this now? It seeks federal highway help for ferries, faces pressure to move capital. I guess the capital move pressure seems to be off for the moment. But it might come back again. We've only had 10 votes, I think, since 1960. So, and no one threatens to secede. Okay, there's great. All right, well, but this is a statement that could be made today, which may, you know, you could have made this lots of times. You could have made this statement a lot of times, right? And, you know, this is still true. This is true, right? Seek natural gas pipeline here. I used to joke that I had a record for writing this headline a number of times in the Newsminer. This was when the Gubik gas pipeline was sort of being considered. That failed for many reasons, one of which may have been the desire by certain interests in the coal industry to keep the coal industry healthy. So that tug of war plays out, right? Continues. And I like this quote. This is a green. This really. See, it doesn't have to be. So this you can use now. I don't have a slide for it, but once the pipeline was completed and oil started flowing, and we started making a lot of money thanks to our friend the Ayatollah, because it was really the Ayatollah who triggered the first big. I mean, after the pipeline was finished in '77, Fairbanks went into a big decline. Not big decline. a big slowdown, let's put it that way, because the pipeline was really intense, things slowed down. The state wasn't really taking in a great deal of money from oil until 1979 and 80, and then there appeared to be no end to it. And in that context, we, as a state, voted to create the Alaska Statehood Commission. And your dad, Jack Coghill, was a big player in that, as was Red Boucher, Ruth Burnett, Nelda Calhoun, Evelyn Conwell, Ed Murdy, Sue Green, Greg Erickson, John Depthovich, and Brian Rogers. So it's sort of a collection of people who had, different views. But by very narrow margin, Alaska voters created the Alaska Statehood Commission, the goal of which was, in essence, to re-examine our relationship with the United States. Now, I'm sure some of you have probably forgotten many of the details of the Alaska Statehood Commission, but I think about this now, and it's sort of astounding. We promoted at the time as saying, well, this was the first time since the Civil War that a state is taking this action, and we're going to look at our relationship with the federal government and see where it might be changed. They came up with had a lot of hearings, wrote a lot of reports, some of which are very good, are still good, because the same issues exist. None of the solutions that were proposed came about. The Jones Act, right? That is still not been repealed. Although oil exports are allowed, great. Oil exports are allowed, but that doesn't really help us at this moment. Although that was one of the key issues. Independence was studied carefully. And now, while there were some people who favored independence, now I lost my page, but I want to read to you exactly what they said, why the commission, in its wisdom, said, no, independence for Alaska is not a good idea. Not because we couldn't afford it. They said, well, we could afford it. And in 1980, it did seem like maybe we could afford it. And not because it wouldn't be practical. Well, the reason was Alaskans identified as Americans. So therefore, we didn't want to pursue independence. To me, this looks like an artifact of long ago, and that we're not in that situation today at all. We don't have the luxury of considering grandiose ideas of that sort, which I think is what the Alaska Statehood Commission was. It coincided with this unbelievable explosion in state revenues and state spending. The problems we have today, many of them stem from habits that were established in 1980, when there was more money than we knew what to do with. And we built all sorts of things, some of which still are around. But on the other hand, you go about your daily life doing the best you can. And I think that's what Alaska has done. In the meantime, we have not resolved this question of what our relationship is with the federal government. And that's always being reinvented and argued over and over again. One advantage we have is that, well, Senator Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan are in the same position as senators who represent tens of millions of people. And so the way our federal Congress is structured, we are overrepresented in the Senate, and I guess we're represented about right in the House, because everybody has at least one, right? But with that, we have, through these decades, even before Stevens, relied heavily on federal funding and federal support. And we're going to continue to have these arguments about what should be within Alaska, the power of Alaskans to decide, and what should be within the power of the federal government to deal with. And I see I've talked for 40 minutes, and that'd probably be enough, but there must be some questions which I can sort of try to answer, I hope. Yes, yeah, sure.
Okay. Mr. Cole, I am Joe Woodward, to whom would the public inquirer complaint that asked the late Senator Stevens' papers to be made public?
Well, the Cedars Foundation controls his papers, and that's a private entity. Eventually they will be made public, you know. I just wish they would hurry up a bit. It was supposed to happen 5 years, 5 years after his death. So that's been, now we're a few years past that now. So, yes, Sue.
This is an announcement in the form of a question. Would you mind reading the piece of paper Peg gave you to the audience here?
What's it work to you? No, okay. If I find it. Okay, here it is. All right, this is, no, I got it. Yeah, this is quote, a related announcement. Okay, by the way, this reminds me of something I found up here, which was just sitting here. It said, this is forum, moderator, welcome, 5 minutes. Get everyone's attention. To make the most of the time, please start on time. This was for the chancellor visits, so anyway, it's still here. Okay, anyway, if you are interested in hearing more about the sesquicentennial and how we celebrate it, please mark Wednesday, September 13th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. on your calendar. I can't read very well. On your calendars. There'll be a live, interactive, online with libraries video conference originating from Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau, featuring historians Terrence Coles, Steve Haycox, Russ Cohen, architect Wayne Jensen, and others. Sponsored by the Alaska Library Network and the State Historical Commission. So September 13th, 6:30 to 8. So there you might get some really official information. I just have my own sort of views on it. Yeah.
There's been some suggestion that the sesquicentennial is a time for people to go back to this old business of who actually, what land was transferred that Native people held.
Meaning, was it all of Russian America or?
That's right, or did Native people have any status over their own lands which would not have been transferred? And I know that discussion is occurring in a lot of Native communities.
Yeah.
You can speak. What's the current status of that?
You think you're asking the wrong person? What? Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, Ron is asking, there is a theory proposed by some people, and I know the theory, but I don't know the answer. The theory is the transfer dealt with a small part of Sitka or something like that only, right? Isn't that what you're thinking of? I think my brother knows something about this. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Ron, I mean, I don't
Wait a minute, I speak louder so I can.
I don't think that's exactly what he's asking.
Oh, okay, well, I don't know.
No, you did okay.
All right, okay, he's not on it. Okay.
You didn't get a microphone. No, so why don't you answer it?
Oh, no.
Repeat
Well, no,
the question.
Okay, the question was, there was a discussion among some people that the transfer of Russian America did not include all of this land that we identify as Alaska, right? That's right, Ron, wasn't that the question?
What
No,
was transferred at
Well,
the time
yeah.
of purchase? Were
Yeah.
Native American lands considered transferable? Or did the Russians
Yeah,
have any control over that land?
Right,
And they transferred it to the U.S.?
So there's just a simple answer. No. It was, either was in Florida, Louisiana, Iowa, Kansas, both Dakotas, South and Dakota. And when Dakota wanted to drop the word north because they thought it would think it was farther south. No, but Dermot, so
Okay, well,
remember this thing that we talked.
yeah.
All right, why don't you want me to shut up?
No, I don't.
Anyway, no, there is a, okay, I'll. I never get to talk.
Wait a minute. Well, finish the question. Finish the
I'll
story.
say one thing. There is a thesis that was prompted by Charlie Edwardson, or ETOC, started in the 1970s. That in fact, the Alaska Purchase only involved 3 acres or 300 acres. Now, several prominent Native leaders, one in particular, I won't mention, actually said, oh yeah, I should have known at the time that this was, in fact, all that the Americans bought was trading rights. Now this is an absolute 100% fallacy along the lines of the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's not a deliberate forgery, but it is a completely ahistorical bozo theory, including a lawyer who works at an Anchorage lawyer in a publication of the National Park Service said that 3 acres were purchased in 1867, which would make Seward the worst real estate. Yeah, right, exactly. That was only 3 acres.
Okay,
So 3 acres is about the size of the Diamond Mall. Anyway, but Dermot, Ron is asking a bigger philosophical question. Is
Were
in
you?
fact,
Okay,
Yeah, he
sorry.
was.
All right,
I was listening.
all right.
Whether or not the United States of America is a legitimate country, and the short answer is no, by that standard. So that's the issue. But we live in a complicated world, and nobody in here has probably ever asked their parents how they were conceived. I'm guessing. Starting hands. Dermot, did you ever?
All right, okay.
The fact is, history is very messy and complicated.
Okay, all right.
Okay, was this the best part of the talk?
All right. All right, next question. Yes.
About 3 years after you arrived, you and I and all the oldsters here voted for a constitutional amendment sponsored or suggested by our poet, J. Hammond, the governor, forming the permanent fund. As I recall, I voted for a rainy day account. And that rainy day account was firm until about 1979, when the legislature passed the dividend. The dividend was contested. The first year, $1,000 was issued to every man, woman, and child. The question I have of you, do you perceive this still as a rainy day account, or is this an entitlement?
Okay, the question was it's Dale, right? Dale? In 1976, the permanent fund amendment went on the ballot and was passed by about 2-to-1 margin. And was it a rainy day account or a entitlement set up with the dividend formula, which came about again in 1980 once oil started flowing and oil money started flowing in large amounts? The answer is yes. How about that? Because it's one of those things that's, let's see. When the permanent fund went, actually that was the second election I participated in here. I remember the first one was in 74. I participated in the election, and I remember voting on the capital move question that was up in 74. And I remember the argument, let's buy the NFL. Anybody remember that? It was the argument, we buy the NFL instead of spending money to buy the Capitol. And I always thought that would remember that. You couldn't buy the NFL today for that, but anyway. This has nothing to do with the permanent fund. Permanent fund in 76, everybody supported it in the legislature except for Bill Ray opposed it, and Terry Miller from North Pole, Terry Miller proposed it. Bill Ray for, who knows why. Terry Miller, he just didn't think it was the right way to go. It was an easy thing to vote for in 1976 because there was no money. And so you were all thinking about the future. In a way, it's probably like the Constitutional Convention. It's an easy thing to write a constitution when it's really imaginary, and you're forecasting things for the future. It's an easier task than when you're pressured at the moment. In 1980, Hammond pushed the dividend. All along, J. Hammond wanted the dividend. And by the way, you can find lots of good quotes from J. Hammond. In fact, Terrence did a long interview with him a few years before his death, in which he says he went on and on about how the rainy day fund, oh, no, it had nothing to do with the rainy day fund. And, well, there's lots of good quotes of him saying it is a rainy day fund. He said it was not a rainy day fund, and it is a rainy day fund. I mean, so the dividend was created in 1980. It's not in the Constitution. It has been elevated to a entitlement. The action taken by the legislature this year, I think, the legislators deserve credit for this, and so does the governor, Walker, as far as I'm concerned. 2 years ago, I thought there would have been zero chance that the dividend for this year, and as of last year, would be cut half in half. Now, nobody did that because they want to do it. Nobody wants to do this. It's an essential step. It has to be done. Other stuff has to be done, which the Senate and House Republicans have not wanted to do as well. That's going to have to take place. But changing the dividend formula is something that has to take place. It still may be that everybody who voted for it will be nailed in the 2018 election on this. But we have to grow up here and face reality about this. We have the lowest taxes in the United States by far right now, excluding the dividend. So if you add that in, it's more so. We have to balance, we have to make judgments about what we want. Now I'm working on today a column for a couple days from now about the Pioneers Home. Now there's 3 or 4 dozen beds in the Pioneers Home statewide that are empty deliberately because they don't have the staff to have enough to deal with the high medical needs of the people who are now in the Pioneers Home. There's a lot of people with Alzheimer's in the Pioneers Home, and you need staff to deal with them. You can't just say, we'll cut this and make people do more with less. But anyway, that's sort of a tangent, but we're not recognizing that. There was a big kerfuffle this year about Pioneers Home funding, but it had nothing to do with this particular instance. But here's an example where they have these empty beds, they have hundreds of people on waiting lists. All the top people on the waiting list have dementia. Not all, most of them have dementia or severe medical needs. It's like, okay, well, what's important to us here, So anyway, my preference this year would have been for the legislature to do a grand bargain of cutting the dividend, instituting income tax, raising oil taxes a little bit, leaving most of that for another day. But we didn't do that. And we have a tough problem going forward. Once we start withdrawing money from the permanent fund without a real formula, of any formula, the temptation is going to be to just take a few dollars more, a few billion more eventually. So that's a tough situation. But back up, the dividend action was that was a positive move by our political establishment. Now, and those who say that they shouldn't have done that, well, I'd like to hear an alternative. You can't just say we'll raise oil taxes. Why? Because you could raise oil taxes. I do believe in raising oil taxes, but the problem with you're not going to raise oil taxes enough when oil's at $50 a barrel to do anything. Oil has to recover to 70 or 80 or 90 for that to make a real difference. So, anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go off that. Clark, yeah.
Sesquicentennial.
Yeah.
Back to the question of was it worth it to the United States to
Yeah.
buy Alaska? In your opinion, on a variety of things, not strictly fiscal, there are pros and cons. I thought you might touch on that. Just pros and cons.
Okay, well, see, it was both in the interest of Russia and the United States to do this, because Russia thought it wouldn't be able to control this country very long, right? And they worried about the British, right? And they thought by selling this to the Americans, it might kind of irritate the British a little bit, I guess. I very quickly get over my head here on this, but the American motives, like manifest destiny, expanding the continent, or expanding our reach. I mean, it clearly was in the best interest of the United States to do this then and now. I mean, that argument is ridiculous. And nobody takes that seriously. But somebody who might take it seriously is our friend, not our president, but this other president, this other leader. So this was in a New York Times story in March. Mr. Putin, he said, we don't need to get worked up about this. However, what we do, he thought that the missile defense program could destabilize world order, right? I don't know. Anyway, our Russian problem is that's a sidetrack. I don't want to go down, but yes, yeah.
I had one question. There was the slide that you showed of the check,
Yeah.
Which actually indicates that the centennial should be maybe next year sometime. We didn't get around to paying for it.
Right. Well, the treaty was approved in 1867, and it's really interesting. This is the big fight. The big fight was getting the House of Representatives to approve the money, because they did not want to approve the money. They were mad at the Senate, and it's kind of interesting to think about that. The first big fight in the Congress over Alaska was this funding bill that didn't get approved until July, I think, 1868.
Thank goodness we can pass appropriation.
Yes, yeah, but look. So that also the backdrop of that was the impeachment proceedings that were going on and these other national issues. But yes, the treaty, the changeover took place in 1867, but it wasn't paid for. There were some suggestions the next year, by the way, that if the House did not act, maybe Russia would just sort of forget it. Well, I don't know if that's true, and I don't know who is promoting that idea, but, and also I think I don't know the full details of, there's lots of these theories about how much money went to buy good publicity and that sort of thing. I guess some of it did, apparently, but, Rich, yeah.
I saw a presentation about the dedication of the Seward statue on 360 North. 5 people, Terrence was on it, Russ Cohn, Stephen Haycox, a few others. And they made a big point about the whole purchase not being actually a purchase, but a cession. That they ceded their interests like you would buy a business. And that there was, there's a case to be made there that that's what they did. They ceded their interest in the whole place, and we didn't really buy the land.
Right.
We just bought their interest in the land. And I think that's a really interesting interpretation.
Could be. I could see those are all professional historians. I don't have I am definitely a rank amateur. So it could be. I don't know the answer, but it sounds like an interesting theory. I'm sure they went on at length about it. Oh, yeah.
What factions in Alaska oppose statehood and why?
The question was what factions in Alaska oppose statehood and why? Okay, the mining industry, the canned salmon industry, and the old-timers who wanted things to stay the way they were. The proponents of statehood were largely people who had come of age during World War II and, were idealistic and looking forward to being able to vote for president and vote for their governor and have elected people in Congress who had power, who weren't just there sort of, begging. So the opposition all along was said to be the financial weight was with the canned salmon interests, which were mainly in Seattle and feared new taxes, as did the mining was more widespread and more smaller entities, but the canned salmon was that was the big business at the time. The oil industry, not maybe what the oil industry is today, Interestingly enough, well, it may not relate at all, but this action taken last week ago by the Trump administration allowing 15,000 more H-2B visas, right? A large part of that is driven by the canneries who are having this record run of Bristol Bay salmon, but they don't have enough people to work in the canneries because for some reason Alaska may have the highest unemployment rate in the country, but it doesn't. These jobs do not appeal to people, and I can understand why. It's 16 and a half hours a day. That's the work schedule there. And the canneries say, well, the employees like it, the foreigners, because they can get overtime. And anyway, if that was changed, by the way, if you didn't have to work 16 hours a day, it would change the whole economics of fishing. I mean, somebody would have to pay a lot more for something. So anyway, that's a sidetrack. Yeah, Carl.
Well, I was thinking that this purchase of Alaska, we bought Alaska for the price of one C-130 on skis. And if we hadn't done that, we could have the Bering Straits would be closed. You wouldn't run submarines through it or any ships through it,
Yeah.
but all be part of Russia, all Bering Sea, which is the richest, biologically the richest sea right now in the world.
You know, that's Carl's question was, or observation was, if we hadn't bought Alaska, it would be, the Bering Strait would be closed because it would be Russian, a total Russian control.
You couldn't even run submarines because it would
Yeah.
be easy to close the whole thing with submarine nets. You could close them, no question at all.
That's true. I mean, that's part of the many things that you don't calculate, you don't put a dollar value on. But you could put a dollar value on if you made certain assumptions, right? How do you put a dollar value on the sunrise? I mean, it does have value. It does have value. Whether or not economists can measure it is something else.
At the present time, the strategic value of Alaska to the United States outweighs anything we've talked about.
Yeah, and Carl said the strategic value of the state outweighs anything we also talked about. That's probably true. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
The hard rock mineral industry is about a $10 billion industry in our state at this time, largely owned by the Canadians and financed by the Japanese, and yet we have almost no royalty from this industry. It is a legislative taboo. Do you have any idea why?
John? Can you answer that, John? I think Senator Coghill can answer this question. By the way, I really respect Senator Coghill. Now, he and I often disagree on things, but he's a true gentleman.
And you don't dare give me a mic.
Actually, the question was about mining taxes, and actually, the governor proposed a mining tax increase a year ago, and I think it went about as far as the fishing tax increase, the fuel increase, the income tax, and a couple of others. Look, that's a legitimate question, why we don't take a broader look at these things. We don't. We've been so focused on oil for the last 40 years that most everything else is, not getting much attention. And unfortunately, we haven't been focused enough on oil. I do think the net profits tax has been a disaster because there's no way to know if you're getting the right amount or not. I mean, it's just impossible. There's how much profit is in the tankers? Anyway, net profits works really well for the state when the oil prices were high, but it's not working too well now, I don't think so. I can't remember exactly why we went to the net profits. I mean, from this period, it doesn't. Okay, this is the hook. I'm getting the hook.
How about one more question?
Yes, yeah. Sure.
Did the salmon industry bail out the university at one point?
Let's see, I think in 1947, the legislature passed a budget that was not sufficient to fund the university. And the canned salmon people may have put it into that. I know Lathrop loaned the money and Bunnell went down shaking down people for donations. Neil Davis has that in his book, I think a good account of that situation, which, by the way, led to the 1949 income tax. And I just found the other day, really interesting, a big description, a big long quote, which I'm going to use here at some point, of John Butrovich being quoted by George Sundberg in congressional testimony about the fight over the income tax in 47. This was when it was defeated. And Butrovich was a big proponent of the income tax and believed it was a grave mistake when the state did away with it in 1980, 79 or 80. But Hammond said this was his greatest regret, one of his greatest regrets, that he didn't veto the bill to eliminate the income tax. However, an initiative to repeal the income tax would have certainly passed. It was going to be on the ballot in 1980, and so it was hopeless. The income tax passed. I think Clem was the only vote against it in the entire legislature. But anyway, that's a long way of saying I'm not sure. But anyway, thank you.